Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. My guest is our favorite Republican, Ed Mandel. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, July 17th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world and the racism we display to those we're killing, in accordance with the Latin proverb, proprium humanae ingeni est odisse cum laceris. It's human nature to hate those you have injured. While the president is talking peace in Helsinki with the president of Russia, the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in those countries, although most Americans are not aware of it. More than 250,000 U.S. troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil, most of them ringing Russia and China. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. today is what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. An international criminal surpassing all others. But most Americans don't know that, protected as they are by government and media propaganda. What we do here at Aware on the Air is talk about the unmentionable, U.S. government killing around the world, and encourage our fellow citizens to oppose it. We'll begin tonight with Ed Mandel. Anything interesting go on in the world this week, Ed?
Well, I suppose I could start with the joke I offered to give it to you, though.
Okay.
The only Russian agent that Trump apparently has met before the election was Hillary Clinton herself.
Well, a Russian agent in the sense that a large amount of money moved from Russia to Hillary.
Right? Selling the uranium to the Russians and everything like that. Yeah.
And the controverted story, the complex, to put no finer point on it, story of Bill Browder and the $400,000 that passed through his hands apparently to the Clintons.
To the Clinton Foundation. Yeah.
In some ways, that was the most surprising revelation of the Putin-Trump press conference, I thought.
Yeah, well, but I do believe there was collusion, but unfortunately they got it wrong.
It went the other way.
It went the other way, unfortunately, and it doesn't look good. But I was going to mention that there is an interesting interview by Aaron Maté. I think I don't know if it's with the guy who wrote the book on the collusion. I forget his name. I've written somewhere. And then he just rips him into the pieces.
Yes, I know who you mean. I'll think of his name in a minute. It's he literally wrote a book on the subject, and Maté, who is quite an interesting interviewer, put him on and just asked him questions about it. But the questions,
Luke Harding,
yes, and the questions just made him look foolish.
Oh yeah.
Because he didn't have any account of what
there was absolutely nothing there. There's no there, and some of the supposedly crimes happened after the election, and this whole indictment of the 12 the Russian intel is all just a cover up by Mueller to justify the $1 million years long investigation. He had to show some results.
I think I think this week it may have been even worse than that. I mean, I think you're right about that as far as it goes, but the indictment this week had as much to do with the Helsinki meeting and the attempt to throw a monkey wrench into that.
Yes.
Mueller didn't want Trump to come away looking good and justified on the no collusion line from Helsinki, which I think, in fact, he did. And the indication that he did is how crazy, absolutely crazy,
Yep.
the American liberal media got about
Yes.
about the whole business. I mean, treason, traitor,
Yep.
it was. And the one I enjoyed most, I think, was John Brennan.
Yep.
John
He's
Brennan,
calling it treason, yes.
the ex-head of the CIA, and he was just beside himself because he recognized that the peaceful intentions of the meeting in Helsinki
Yeah.
was apparent to anyone who wanted to look, and that the American political establishment, so desperate to make sure that peace doesn't break out, because the war and war preparations are so much in the interest of the American 1%, we're entirely flummoxed by the conversation between Putin and Trump.
Well, I was going to mention several things. For instance, I guess you could say that this press conference with Trump and Putin was the finally the collusion story that Mueller was looking for.
Yes.
Unfortunately, and it looks ridiculous. And the other thing you could say, I found the quote by Greenwald, which I can't locate right now, but having to do with the idea that. When Obama offered to speak with Putin years ago during when he first became president, the media was hey, this is great. We got to have a conversation rather than having nothing. And now when Trump does the same thing, now it's treason.
I think there is a little danger, perhaps, in seeing the contrast that you quite rightly sketch as being just a personal contrast, a contrast between Trump's problematic character and Obama's hidden character, we might say.
I would contrast Trump with actually 30 years of presidency. So I would go back in time. So not just Obama. I would go back to previous presidents, in plural.
Well, that's a good point, and I think that's right, and that was what I was going to suggest in a way. I think it's important to see, if we can look away from Trump's peculiar personality for a little while, it's important to see that he became president at least in part because he was the first major candidate in 40 years, as you suggest, to attack the neoliberal and neoconservative policies that characterized earlier administrations, Bush's and Obama's as well. Neoliberalism is the extension of corporate globalism, the rule of capital around the world, regardless of local objections, the sorts of things that the American 1% has been doing for a long time. Neoconservatism is the assertion of American military power in defense of that rule of global capitalism, or of American capitalism, in fact, and that these characterize the policies of all recent American administrations, the result being more war and more inequality. What elected Trump was the fact that inequality grew rapidly in a wartime condition in the Obama administration. Inequality accelerated in the Obama years, and Obama was the first president ever to have been at war throughout 2 presidential terms. And it was finally war in the economy that elected Donald Trump.
I would say it's more than that. I would say it's more so because, for example, when Ron Paul ran for election several years ago, the media kept on ignoring him. And I think that a lot of people who supported Trump, actually some of them at least believed in Ron Paul. And I think that's true. Myself. And I think that people were upset because they kept on being ignored. So I think that Trump is not just war. But I think it's it's an accumulation of issues where the American people felt that they were being ignored and they were being overlooked in their opinion.
Yes.
And so finally they have a person who's fighting back. And I think that people are like that because for all his flaws, his character flaws, people were willing to overlook those character flaws and say, here's the guy who's fighting back. And that's the thing they like about him.
And I agree with that, with the proviso or the addition that being overlooked was not just a matter of social graces or something of that sort, things in which Trump is perhaps a bit lacking. Being overlooked meant that the economic conditions, the real life circumstances of Americans were being increasingly squeezed for an awful lot of Americans, and a lot of people who voted for Obama for a hope and change on that ground after 8 years of Obama heard more of Mrs. Clinton saying, well, we're going to do essentially what the last administration, and they said, I'm out of here. I've tried this. That's enough. Yep. And the Obama voters who stayed home from voting for Clinton were the crucial swing group that elected Trump, I think.
I won't disagree with that.
There's a lot of survey data that suggests that, too.
Probably several states, probably Wisconsin or several states
exactly.
probably made a difference there.
Michigan, Pennsylvania as well.
Yep. I won't disagree with that. So I was going to mention that there's a lot of yellow journalism right now.
Oh, yeah? Some of that going on?
I got the Post here having an unbelievable thing here. I mean, they're not even going back to Pearl Harbor and Kristallnacht, but they're going back to the 1898 the Spanish-American War.
It's incredible.
They're reaching back in time to, I guess, the golden oldies of the past, and I don't think they even realize what they're doing is.
I'm sorry that the novelist Gore Vidal is gone, because Vidal, for all his peculiar personality, was a historical novelist who recreated some of these eras in American history in quite a remarkable way. His novel about the Spanish-American War and the propaganda, you can call it nothing else, that the newspapers put together in order to, the press put together in order to get the U.S. into that war. It's a brilliant portrait. I mean, if I had undergraduates coming to me now saying, what should I read on American history? I mean, I'd mention things like Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States and so forth, other things as well. But I would also say, go read Gore Vidal's novels if you want to know about American history.
I guess that's the original fake news, I guess.
Yes, exactly.
I mentioned it in the movie Citizen Kane. The original, the yellow journalism.
That's right.
The original fake news.
I've got you mentioned Ron Paul here. I've got a brief piece from Ron Paul that
go ahead.
That is worthwhile.
Sure.
Ron Paul writes, the term deep state has been so overused in the past few years that it may seem meaningless. It's become standard practice to label one's political adversaries as representing the deep state as a way of avoiding the defense of one's own position. President Trump has often blamed the deep state for his political troubles. Trump's supporters have created big conspiracies, we were talking about these before we went on the air tonight, involving the deep state to explain why the president places neocons in key positions or fails to fulfill his campaign promises. But the deep state, this is Ron Paul's view, and I think it's essentially correct, but the deep state is no vast and secret conspiracy theory. The deep state is real, it operates out in the open, and it's far from monolithic. The deep state is simply the permanent, unelected government that continues to expand its power regardless of how Americans vote. There are factions of the deep state that are pleased with President Trump's policies, and in fact we might say that President Trump represents some factions of the deep state. Other factions of the deep state are determined to undermine any of President Trump's actions they perceive as threatening. Any move towards peace with Russia is surely something they feel to be threatening. There are hundreds of billions of reasons, otherwise known as dollars, why the Beltway military-industrial complex is terrified of peace breaking out with Russia and will do whatever it takes to prevent that from happening. That's why Deputy Attorney General Ron Rosenstein's indictment on Friday a week, of 12 Russian military intelligence officers for allegedly interfering in the 2016 U.S. presidential election should immediately raise some very serious questions. First, the obvious. After more than a year of investigations, which have publicly revealed zero collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, Why drop this bombshell of an allegation at the end of the news cycle on the last business day before the historic Trump-Putin meeting in Helsinki? The indictment could not have been announced a month ago or in 2 weeks from now. Is it not suspicious that now no one is talking about reducing tensions with Russia, but all of a sudden, thanks to Special Counsel Robert Mueller, talking about increasing tensions? Unfortunately, most Americans don't seem to understand that indictments are not evidence. In fact, they are often evidence-free, as is this indictment. Did the Russian government seek to interfere in the 2016 U.S. presidential elections? It's certainly possible. However, we don't know. None of the Justice Department's assertions have been tested in a court of law, as is thankfully required by our legal system. It's not enough to make an allegation, as Mueller has done. You have to prove it. That's why we should be very suspicious of these new indictments. Mueller knows he will never have to defend his assertions in a court of law, so he can make any allegations he wants. Putin almost overturned that in the actual discussion, didn't he? By saying, "Yeah, come on, we'll send these people there. You just have to send some of your people here."
Yeah.
It's interesting. One of the Russian companies indicted by Mueller earlier this year surprised the world by actually entering a not guilty plea. They sent a lawyer to New York and demanding to see Mueller's evidence. Mm-hmm. The special counsel proceeded to file several motions to delay the handover of evidence. It still hasn't been handed over. What does Mueller have to hide? Meanwhile, why is no one talking about the estimated 100 elections the U.S. government has meddled in since World War II? Maybe we need to get our own house in order? Once again, eminent sense from Ron Paul. It seems to me that it's quite right and hard to argue with, but certainly that's not the account we've gotten from
I've been hearing
mainstream media.
I've been hearing radio news this morning, for instance, saying that this is more important than anything the United States has done, even though there have been I think there have been assassinations. We've overthrown the governments in South America, and now it's the classic one in Iran. We installed the Shah, and so we've done a lot of damage. So. What Russia is doing, or allegedly did, is so minor. It's almost like laughable. I mean, they spent a few $100,000 that overturned an election, even though was it $1 billion campaign by Hillary Clinton? It's like, come on, that's bogus. Come on.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's right.
I don't think there's any.
You're watching Aware. You're watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, the local peace group. Our remit is the discussion of the war news that you don't hear on American media, while you're hearing about what a foul-up Donald Trump is.
I suppose I could ask you about certain things that are more authentic. I mean, for instance, what is the situation with Julian Assange? I think he's being evicted from the Ecuador embassy because they have a new president in Ecuador.
That's right.
So what's the situation with him? Or maybe you don't know. I don't know.
No, I don't think it's not clear, but it does seem to be very dangerous. The U.S. is working very hard to make sure that the new Ecuadorian government, as you say, Lenin Morales, the successor to the former president of Ecuador, who had granted asylum to Assange, is apparently working under a good deal of U.S. pressure to dissolve that asylum and to deliver Assange into the hands of the British police, at which point the U.S. will extradite him on charges of espionage.
I mean, shockingly, there I'm asking because shockingly, Julian Assange has his WikiLeaks is accurate news, like an accurate news source.
Exactly, that's right.
And he's established over the course of many years. I mean, so that's like amazing.
It's a vicious situation and very bad. And I must say that this is another place in which self-styled American liberals have shown themselves up as worse than their opponents, as they are now on war provocations against Russia. Our own senior senator, Senator Durbin was one of 10 Democratic senators who wrote a letter to Vice President Pence last month, as Pence was off to Ecuador to talk to the government of Ecuador. And in this letter, Senator Durbin and his colleagues not only repeated all of the Russiagate nonsense, how the Russians and directly President Putin himself had interfered in American elections. He took that all for granted. But also, he called upon the vice president to bring more pressure on the Ecuadorian government to dissolve the asylum granted to Julian Assange and to turn him over to his enemies, primarily the American government. This was a shameful operation for an American liberal, self-styled liberal, and one of the other reasons that I can't see delivering Congress into the hands of the Democrats this fall. I am, for the first time in my life, Ed, probably going to vote for an incumbent Republican congressman in this district.
You're freaking me out, man.
Sorry to do this to you. Only because, not because our feckless congressman is any great shakes. He's not. On most points, he and his Democratic challenger hold essentially the same positions, and certainly on important points like the war. But the most important thing, I think, is not the individual office holder in this case, but the party. If enough Democrats are elected to House seats, the Democrats will have control of the House and be able to organize it. And the Democrats who are talking the way Durbin is about Russiagate and so forth, and are doing their best to destroy the peace moves by the Trump administration, these people should not have control of the House of Representatives. And so here I am in the peculiar position of voting for a feckless Republican in this congressional district.
Yeah, you're shocking. No, but I will say, obviously, Durbin was trying to get his spin into WikiLeaks, and obviously WikiLeaks was obviously with Assange is desperately trying to get the truth out of it. Is from his news sources. And
Well, I'm shocking you and talking about Republicans in less than hostile fashion. Let me take one more step and talk about a man who is an interesting anomaly in American political life these days, and has been for many years. I'm speaking of Patrick Buchanan, who is certainly not a liberal in any of the usual definitions, nor really a conservative.
Well, Nixon's speechwriter.
Yes, Nixon's former speechwriter, and who ran for president himself at one point. Patrick Buchanan is a paleo-conservative, not a neo-conservatism, that is the hawkish military folks who fled the who fled the Republican Party in the last election in order to support the hawkishness of Hillary Clinton. No, he's not a neo-conservative at all. He is a paleo-conservative. Paleo means old-time or old-fashioned. A paleo-conservative in a tradition that goes back to Robert Taft, and a position that has been excoriated as isolationist in our parents' and grandparents' generation. Isolationist in the sense that it criticizes the wars that America has fought since 1945. Most Americans don't realize that in the years since the end of the Second World War, the U.S. has been responsible for the deaths of more than 20 million people around the world, from Korea to Vietnam to Latin America to elsewhere, in wars which were finally designed to maintain America's economic hegemony as it was established at the end of the Second World War. These are criminal wars, criminal actions, and the rest of the world recognizes it, although Americans don't. 20 million people and more killed in these economic wars by the United States, which continue today across the world. Now, in that situation, a political tradition vanishing as it is of isolation and non-intervention is a consummation devoutly to be wished. It was Trump's reanimation of that non-interventionist tradition in the last election that so horrified traditional liberals, and we see the continuation of that in Trump's trip to London and his discussions with NATO.
Carl, what was Buchanan's positions that you found rather interesting?
This is a piece from Patrick Buchanan this week entitled "Trump Calls Off Cold War II." Beginning his joint press conference with Vladimir Putin, President Trump declared that U.S. relations with Russia have, quote, never been worse, close quote. He then added pointedly that had just changed, quote, about 4 hours ago. So Trump was very conscious about the ways in which the meeting with Putin, so abominated by American liberals, was designed precisely to improve relations with Russia, as Trump had said he would do during the campaign. And that's what scared all the neocons away. With his remarks in Helsinki and at the NATO summit in Brussels, Trump has signaled a historic shift in U.S. foreign policy that may determine the future of this nation and the fate of his presidency. He has rejected the fundamental premises of American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War and blamed our wretched relations with Russia not on Vladimir Putin, but squarely on the U.S. establishment. In a tweet prior to the meeting, Trump indicted the elites of both parties. Quote, "Our relationship with Russia has never been worse, thanks to many years of U.S. foolishness and stupidity, and now the rigged witch hunt," close quote. That's Trump. Trump, in a sense, is being generous there. It talks about many years of U.S. foolishness and stupidity. I would say it was U.S. hostility and viciousness towards what Zbigniew used to call peer competitors, mainly Russia and China. What the U.S. government has done since the Clinton years, since the fall of the Soviet Union, and Americans seem to have trouble remembering that Russia is not the Soviet Union is not Russia, but that's another matter perhaps. What the U.S. did in the Clinton administration when the Soviet Union collapsed was to try to ruin the Russian economy and reduce it to the status of a third world economy that supplied raw materials to the West under the control of Western capital. It was quite an amazing campaign that the Clinton administration undertook to produce the to produce an economic depression in Russia far worse than the economic depression in the United States in the 1930s. It even had the effect, that is, the Clinton policies in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, had the effect of reducing the life expectancy. In the modern world, life expectancy has expanded at varying rates, it's true, but it went the other way in the 90s and the turn of the century. In Russia as a result of Western policies towards Russia and specifically the policies of the Clinton administration. One of the reasons that the West, that Western liberals, and I must say the Clinton family specifically, hates Vladimir Putin is that Putin was the agent of turning around that immiseration of Russia that had been directed consciously and purposely by the Clinton administration, the Bill Clinton administration, of course. And the fact that Russia pulled out of that and moved in the opposite direction was largely due to the leadership of Putin and his associates, and the Clintons have never forgiven him. That's the root, if you like, of Hillary Clinton's charge that Trump was Putin's puppet, and the subsequent Russiagate nonsense. This goes back to the 1990s and the fall of the Soviet Union, and the observation by the American political figure that all politics are local.
I actually agree with Jimmy Dore, of all people, who's actually a progressive.
Yes.
Which I politically disagree with, but I still think he's some of his observations are extremely accurate. And I think the main reason for this Russian collusion story was not only just to try to distract the Trump campaign, but was try to prevent the Democrat Party from imploding, which is going to happen anyway, which is happening anyway. But they desperately wanted people not to realize why they cheated Bernie Sanders out of winning the primaries,
right,
winning the nomination. And so because they by bringing up this collusion story, they literally controlled the conversation, and they prevented another conversation from never happening.
I think that's quite right.
And I think by dominating, regardless of how false and phony this conversation, and it is, I mean, it prevented a lot of other conversations from never happening.
Yes, I think that's very true.
And whether it's an internal conversation within the Democratic Party, or it's other conversations that they're attempting to sidetrack the Trump administration from handling real issues. And I think it's all going to fail. I think it's all going to fail in November, but that's me. Sorry.
I think this is right, and I think what Trump has done in this meeting with Putin is challenge the alternate explanations that have been given for the Democrats' defeat in the last presidential election. There is a crucial issue here, and that is the relationship with Russia. That Trump was talking about it, and the Clinton forces and the Democratic Party in general were doing their best to occlude that, to ignore it, to put that aside, and suggest that Clinton was beaten by deplorables and people like that, racists, misogynists, and so forth. Not that she was beaten by people who heard from Trump reasonable things about war and the economy, things that they'd been lied to about by previous administrations, and particularly the previous administration, and opted for something different.
You must agree that Trump is doing things that Hillary Clinton would never have done.
Exactly. Exactly.
She was planning to be a much more militaristic viewpoint, much more of a. She was bringing up different military operations, and these things would never. I mean, she would have done things that Trump has not even considered. He wants to discuss the issues. She would never have gone to Korea to talk with Kim. And there are things that she would never have done.
This is a crucial point, Ed. You're absolutely right. William Blum, who has written about the CIA and American policy perhaps better than anyone else, he's been around for a long time. He's even older than I am. Wrote before the election. This was in March, or a year ago last March. William Blum wrote, Trump is much more a critic of U.S. foreign policy than Hillary or Bernie. He speaks of Russia and Vladimir Putin as positive forces and allies. This is March of 2016, and would be much less likely to go to war against Moscow than Clinton would. He calls Iraq a complete disaster, that's Trump, condemning not only George W. Bush, but the neocons who surrounded him. Mm-hmm. Quote, they lied, they said there were weapons of mass destruction and there were none, and they knew there were none. There were no weapons of mass destruction, close quote. Now that's, while people were worried about Trump's hair, this is what he was saying about war, and that made a difference in the campaign. William Blum concludes this account from 2 years ago with the remark, yes, he's personally obnoxious. He means Trump, of course. I'd have a very hard time being his friend. Who cares? Now that seems to me that's important. What William Blum is saying there is that we're talking about war and peace, and that the position of the Democrats and Hillary Clinton, as you suggest, was warmongering, warlike. That's precisely right, and that's what this meeting with Putin has brought out and has driven the pro-Clinton, pro-Democrat mainstream media absolutely nuts. Literally, I mean, it's almost as if they are literally crazy because what they're saying makes no sense. What they're talking about is how Trump has somehow ruined the wonderful American foreign policy, and Trump is clear enough that foreign policy was far from wonderful.
Well, Carl, how humiliating is it that a political neophyte like Donald Trump, who has absolutely no political experience, is doing more in the last year and a half than other practiced politicians have done in the last 30 years?
I think it's more important what he's done, as William Blunt was talking about. You know, and he's not fallen into the standard American. We've got to be, we've got to confront Russia and China. Right. He's moving in the other direction now. Obviously, there's been all sorts of pressures on this administration, including from within this administration, to move in different directions. But before this meeting with Putin last week, Trump tweeted, a favored form of casual political comments these days, quote, "Our relationship with Russia has never been worse, thanks to many years of U.S. foolishness and stupidity, and now the rigged witch hunt," the attempt to show that Trump is Putin's puppet. He's exactly right about that. Trump thereby repudiated the records and agendas of the neocons and their liberal interventionist allies, as well as the archipelago of war party think tanks beavering away inside the Beltway. Looking back over the week, from Brussels to Britain to Helsinki, Trump's message has been clear, consistent, and startling. NATO is obsolete. It is. European allies have freeloaded off U.S. defense. They have. While rolling up huge trade surpluses at our expense. Those days are over. Europeans are going to stop stealing our markets and start paying for their own defense. And there will be no Cold War II. That is, the conflict with Russia that made all those nice monies flow in the direction of Europe. We're not going to let Putin's annexation of Crimea, by the way, a much misinterpreted event. We're not going to let Putin's annexation of Crimea or aid to pro-Russian rebels in Ukraine, once again, quite misinterpreted in American media, prevent us from working on a rapprochement and a partnership with him, Trump is saying. We're going to negotiate arms treaties and talk out our differences as Ronald Reagan did with Mikhail Gorbachev. We forget, indeed, that happened. Helsinki showed that Trump meant what he said when he declared repeatedly, quote, "Peace with Russia is a good thing, not a bad thing," close quote. It's the sort of things
conversation
Trump was saying.
Yeah. Conversation, or even
exactly.
whatever it is better than actually killing people.
There was a line attributed to the awful racist and warmonger Winston Churchill, but actually a good line, and so probably not his at all. And you need an approximation of a British upper class accent in order to make the line sound right, but Churchill is supposed to have said, jaw, that is talking, jaw is better than war.
Oh my.
Yes, exactly. As I say, it works only if you can do the accent.
I sure hope so.
But jaw is better than war. It's better to talk than to fight.
Oh yeah, makes it wow.
Buchanan continues, "We are not going to let Putin's annexation, sorry, I mentioned that. Helsinki showed that Trump meant what he said when he declared repeatedly, peace with Russia is a good thing, not a bad thing. On Syria, Trump indicated that he and Putin are working with Bibi Netanyahu, of all people, who wants all Iranian forces and Iran-backed militias kept far from the Golan Heights. As for U.S. troops in Syria, says Trump, they will be coming out after ISIS is crushed, and we are 98% there." screaming and hollering in the Pentagon, the CIA, many other places, but that is indeed what Trump has said, and it looks like he may do it. There is another underlying message here. America is coming home from foreign wars and will be shedding foreign commitments. That's what really drives the neocons and the liberal interventionists nuts. Both before and after the Trump-Putin meeting, the cable news coverage was as hostile and hateful toward the president as any this writer has ever seen. Now remember, this is Pat Buchanan, who was Nixon's man, and he says the hostility towards Trump from the mainstream media is worse than that towards Nixon. And I'm old enough to remember what it was like towards Nixon, and so in fact is Pat Buchanan. The media may not be the enemy of the people Trump says they are, but many are implacable enemies of this president. Some wanted Trump to emulate Nikita Khrushchev, who blew up the Paris summit in May 1960 over a failed U.S. intelligence operation, the U-2 spy plane shot down over the Urals just weeks earlier. Khrushchev had demanded that Ike apologize. Ike refused, and Khrushchev exploded. Some media seem to be hoping for just such a confrontation in Helsinki this week. When Trump spoke of the foolishness and stupidity of the U.S. foreign policy establishment that contributed to this era of animosity in U.S.-Russia relations, what might he have had in mind? Was it the U.S. provocatively moving NATO into Russia's front yard after the collapse of the USSR? Was it the U.S. invasion of Iraq to strip Saddam Hussein of weapons of mass destruction he did not have that plunged us into endless wars in the Middle East? Was it U.S. support of Syrian rebels determined to oust Bashar al-Assad, leading to ISIS intervention in a 7-year civil war with 500,000 dead, a war which Putin eventually entered to save his Syrian ally? Was it George W. Bush's abrogation of Richard Nixon's ABM treaty and drive for a missile defense that caused Putin to break out of the Reagan IMF treaty and start deploying cruise missiles to counter it? Was it U.S. complicity in the Kiev coup in Ukraine that ousted the elected pro-Russian regime that caused Putin to seize Crimea to hold on to Russia's Black Sea naval base at Sevastopol? Many Putin actions we condemn were reactions to what we did. Russia annexed Crimea bloodlessly, but did not the U.S. bomb Serbia for 78 days to force Belgrade to surrender her cradle province of Kosovo? How was that more moral than what Putin did in Crimea? It certainly wasn't. If Russian military intelligence hacked into the emails of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, exposing how they stuck it to Bernie Sanders, Trump says he did not collude in it. Is there perhaps, after 2 years, any proof that he did? The answer is no. There's no proof they did. And indeed, no, those emails were probably not hacked anyhow. It was an internal leak, not eternal, an internal leak that we are finding more and more about. And indeed, the name Seth Rich needs to be mentioned here. Yep. Trump insists Russian meddling had no effect on the outcome in 2016, and he is not going to allow media obsession with Russiagate to interfere with establishing better relations with Russia. Former CIA Director John Brennan rages that, quote, Donald Trump's press conference performance in Helsinki was treasonous. He is wholly in the pocket of Putin. Republican patriots, where are you? Close quote from the mad John Brennan, mad in both senses. As Patrick Henry said long ago, this is Buchanan writing now, as Patrick Henry said long ago, if this be treason, make the most of it.
So are you going to do a walk-away to your video night? Did you lose all your friends for quoting back to Pat Buchanan? I'm sorry.
I'm just joking with you. It seems to me.
No, I mean, if someone's speaking the truth that you can identify with, I guess there you go.
We've said on these programs for a long time, as sort of a bromide and watchword almost, no one can be wrong all the time.
There you go.
And Pat Buchanan, although I think he is wrong a lot of the time, and has been over the years, back to the time when Richard Nixon was a baby. The fact of the matter is that he's often right. I remember, for example, that he was a clear opponent to what was probably the greatest political crime of this century so far, unfortunately, that is the invasion of Iraq. Although he was identified as a Republican and a conservative of some sort, a paleo-conservative, as we said, in 2003, he was adamant that the excuses for killing people in Iraq were absolutely inadequate. It was a great crime that the U.S. was launched upon, that the Bush administration was launched upon, the U.S. government was launched upon.
I thought you would go back in time and mention about Cambodia, and I guess when Pat Buchanan was
well, and indeed, it's worthwhile to talk about the complicity of Buchanan with the Nixon wars. You're absolutely right about that. What I'm saying is that nobody can be wrong all the time.
There you go.
And Buchanan has done pretty well on that point.
So I was going to mention another odd thing. Jimmy Dore has been mentioning Tucker Carlson, believe it or not. He's been quoting Tucker Carlson, who, the Fox News reporter, as a reliable source, which is kind of shocking. I'm being serious. You'll have to look into that, because it's just it's amazing how certain people are certain people source find people finding strange sources of information that you would never suspect.
Maybe he and Patrick Buchanan represent an examples of Hunter Thompson's observation from many years ago. When the going gets weird, the weird turn pro.
There you go.
We have a couple of pro weirdos here doing things exactly.
Hunter dealt with the drugs there. I don't know how much of a drug taking you was he took, but I don't think distorted his perception. You're watching Aware on the Air, and we're talking about the remarkable events of the week in which President Trump of the U.S. and President Putin of Russia have met, and the victims are those who believe the standard account of American politics that has been upended, indeed, by Trump from his entrance into the campaign, the presidential campaign, to now. As William Blum said, I wouldn't want to be his friend, but who cares? And it seems to me what Blum is pointing to is that all the talk about the unattractive aspects of Trump's personality take us away, perhaps consciously takes us away from the assessment of what his government is actually doing. There are many things his government is doing that should be actively opposed, but there are many other things, including this meeting with President Putin, that should be praised and applauded as a departure from the warmongering and war provocations of the last administrations and previous administrations. I don't think that's possible to deny. So, Carl, I don't want to distract you from engaging in this conversation, but there was something else that's happening in France. For instance, in France, there's a lot of rioting happening in France. With over the killing of an immigrant. And I guess it's now been I don't know if the writing is still current. Obviously they're writing because of the World Cup victory. But I don't mean to make light of the situation, but apparently they're writing over the killing of an immigrant, and I don't know if you know anything more about that, or is that current?
I think the important point maybe for Americans to think about when we're dealing with the obfuscated politics or the obfuscated account of politics that we get from mainstream media is where the difficulties with migrants, refugees, and others in Europe, and indeed a parallel in the United States with kids in cages, which has horrified the conscience of Americans in these last couple of weeks. We get to the source of this difficulty is the point that, remarkably enough, we don't talk about. It's American policy in Africa and in Latin America that produces these refugees in the first place. It's the 8 wars throughout the Middle East and North Africa that sends migrants on dangerous journeys across the Mediterranean. It's American support for coups in Honduras and elsewhere that sends refugees north to the American border. The problems that the U.S. is facing, the problems that France is facing with migrants, are the result of American policy.
Let me see if I can understand this, though. But you would just say that Hillary Clinton's endorsing the overthrow, for instance, of the Libyan government, which was basically stable when it was. Was basically stable when they overthrew it. It turned it into a situation where people needed to leave, which created part of the migrant situation.
Well, that's right. And remember, it was more than just an overseeing. I mean, there's no question that Hillary Clinton was the moving force behind the Obama-Clinton administration's attack on Libya.
She seemed rather proud of it.
What started out as, there are parallels here in what happened in Libya and what happened in Syria and elsewhere, where the United States intervenes in a domestic dispute, a dispute that has the outlines of a rebellion, and I'm talking now particularly of Libya and Syria, and does what it can to heighten the contradictions in these countries in order to overthrow governments that are not willing to follow orders from Washington. That's notably the case in Gaddafi's government in Libya and Assad's government in Syria. In both cases, well, I just pointed out that in both cases, the U.S. is hiring the most radical Islamic terrorists it can find in order to attack these actually fairly progressive governments that the U.S. wants to overthrow because they're not subservient to Washington. This is not a new policy. This has been American policy for 40 years.
Right.
This is a policy that Zbigniew Brzezinski, as National Security Advisor, arranged for Jimmy Carter in the Carter administration, where the most fanatic Muslim fighters they could find were sent into Afghanistan, quote, as Brzezinski said, to give Russia a Vietnam of its own. And the idea was to produce an annoyance, a major annoyance, to Russia. It led to the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. Remember, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, like the Russian invasion of Syria, although we speak of it as an invasion, it was in fact the entrance of troops at the invitation of a legitimate government in order to put down a rebellion that was being encouraged by the United States by the addition of jihadists, by the addition of Muslim terrorists. The parallels are very great, and if anyone's around to write the history of the last administration and its attempt to overthrow governments, the viciousness of Hillary Clinton will be an important part of it. We came, we saw, he died. She referred to the leader of Libya after her agents rammed a bayonet up his anus and killed him. This is one of the most progressive leaders in Africa, and the attempt to do the same thing to Syria was part of the Obama administration as well.
Saddam Hussein, he had a stable government in Iraq before it was overthrown, and even though you might disagree with him, it's still he had a very secular government.
Exactly right.
In Iraq, and so when they overthrew it, it completely destabilized the whole situation there, and that probably also contributed to the migrant situation that exists right now.
When we realize the similarity of American policy over more than a generation here, we realize what a challenge it was when Trump comes along and says, I don't want to do that anymore.
Yes.
Even Americans who were not aware of the details of the history of Iraq, of Syria, of Libya, and so forth, still knew that they were hearing something new here and responded to it.
So you would credit Trump for at least starting the process of challenging all the foreign policy from the past in his own way. I mean,
exactly.
It's a very difficult process. The thing how to go about doing this,
right?
But he's attempting to challenge 40 years or whatever.
Exactly.
Challenging NATO, challenging all these things from the past.
I think that's exactly right.
And he is going berserk because he's challenging all these things from the past.
I think you can't deny it, that indeed what was happening, and that the difficulty was that most Americans were not aware of what was going on here, and that too was no accident, because the accounts that Americans got through mainstream media were all regime friendly, that is the regime of the United States, which means the support for the warmongering and interventionist policies of all those years.
Well, the standard discussion and the standard argument, that the thing that's been good all through the years, is that the United States has always been trying to install democracies in other countries, and that's not necessarily always been true.
That's
or
right.
If at all, actually. I mean, I just kind of. Unfortunately, the reality is hits you in the face there. I mean, we've installed dictators and we've installed all sorts of unusual governments over there, overseas.
You're watching Aware on the Air. We have a few minutes left. Anywhere particular you want to go with it?
Well, we took care of France.
France took care of everybody else in the World Cup.
Yeah, I guess we went World Cup there.
I have something here.
I suppose we could mention about the walk-away movement. I don't know if we've mentioned that before, but that's not really a foreign issue, a foreign affairs issue. But it might. I think it might have a major impact on the election in November.
You may be right. I hope it does. I think, as I was saying earlier, it seems to me that it's a mistake to give the Democrats control of Congress, and the walk-away movement, which is relatively new to me. We were talking about it before the show today.
Yeah.
Is a movement of dissident Democrats, eh?
Yeah, it involves all sorts of groups that unfortunately Democrats would be. It's like, oh my gosh, oh my goodness, because we're talking about gays, women, and African Americans. So we're talking about
those identity politics groups that the Democrats were counting on.
Yes, we're talking the core of their support is suddenly like saying we've had enough, we're leaving. And it's like, oh my goodness. And now right now the Democrats are trying to dismiss this. I believe that this movement began. It officially began in May of this year, but I believe it began even before the 2016 election when Bernie Sanders lost his nomination to Hillary. And this is my own personal belief. And now it's reaching exponential growth and spreading. And so by November and to 2020, it's going to be so massive that I don't think the Democrats are going to be able to survive.
And I think that's the primary reason that there has been such enthusiasm in mainstream media for this young woman, Ocasio-Cortez, in New York. She's not from the district where you lived in New York. Right?
No.
14th district, right?
No, I'm not sure. Yeah, that's in the city. I don't know if it's the Bronx.
Oh, right. Oh, okay.
But she beat Joe Crowley, I believe.
Yes,
and who was planning to succeed Pelosi.
That's precisely right.
Yeah.
And from the looks of Pelosi, that someone's going to succeed Pelosi, regardless of what happens.
I don't know who that's going to be because they're all vanishing, just like her mind. That's another story.
No, it's. I think the fortunes of the Democratic Party, are so desperate that they're looking for a new sheepdog, and a young, attractive female sheepdog is just good as any.
Well, yeah.
A lot more of that. We have a moment left. A final story?
No, nothing extraordinary.
Maybe next week will be as interesting as this week. I hope so, I guess. You've been watching Aware on the Air for Tuesday, July 17th in the 29th week of 2018. Another week in which the U.S. government remains what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. We must stop it. Our program is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scollery. Our thanks also to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, reminding you, in the words of Edgar de Vere and The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. Thanks, Ed.
You're welcome.